The 12th battle was on Mount Badon, in which there fell in one day 960 men from one charge by Arthur, and no one struck them down except Arthur himself. That is from Nennius, written in 829 AD. By the year 410 AD, the southern half of Great Britain had been ruled by the Roman Empire for roughly 3.5 centuries. If that doesn't feel like all that long of a time to you, try and keep in mind that the United States of America, as of this month, has really only been around for 250 years. So 350 years is a pretty good run for Roman Britain. It's safe to say that in 410 AD, the people of the Roman province called Britannia, that's what the Romans called Roman Britain, they were used to their position in the Roman world. Britannia was the northernmost province of the Roman Empire, and it was also one of the empire's most troublesome provinces. It took a really long time for Britain's native inhabitants to accept the idea of Roman rule. There's a series of revolts, most famously Boudicca's revolt in 61 AD, but these revolts are ultimately crushed by the Roman army, and over time, the native Britons acclimated to Roman living. They blended their Celtic gods with the Roman gods, and they produced these interesting hybrid cults that sometimes even came to be worshipped in the city of Rome itself. We actually see some Celtic gods making their way to Rome and getting temples and shrines there. In Britain, the Romans are building Roman-style cities, which we call civitases, that's the Latin word for it. And the Britons actually, some of them came to live in villas modeled after those in the Italian countryside. Many of them educated their children in the Latin and Greek classics. So there's a great degree of acclimation that's going on here. Despite all this, Britannia was not an easy province for the Romans to hold on to, and that's because Britannia was on the very edge of the Roman world. It wasn't bordered by other Roman provinces. It was bordered by neighboring barbarian tribes. So to the north, you have the Picts, of course, who are living in modern-day Scotland. And then in the west, you have the Irish, the native inhabitants of Ireland, who are making these overseas pirate raids into Roman Britain. And some of them even establish coastal settlements in Roman Britain, making it even easier to conduct raids and trade with the Romano British population. You'll remember that Constantine the Great was first proclaimed emperor in Britain, and he was there because he was actually leading an army against the Picts. So in the 350 years that Britain is really administered by the Romans, you see quite a few of these Roman armies and some Roman emperors even dispatched from the Roman heartland in Italy and Greece to go deal with these barbarian incursions into Britannia. Was Britannia really worth it for the Romans to hold on to and spend all this treasure protecting? There's a lot of debate about this. Obviously, there were these tin mines in Britannia that were very valuable for the Romans. But the Romans tended to hold on to Britain more as a political gesture than anything else. The Emperor Claudius first invaded Britain because he felt like he needed a big victory to kind of cement his legitimacy. And we see later emperors who, even though Britain was very difficult to hold on to, they tried to maintain a strong presence there so as to uphold Claudius's legacy and their own legitimacy. And one thing you have to keep in mind here is that the cost of outfitting Roman armies and then sending them all the way to Britain, making sure that their supply lines were intact, I mean, the cost of these operations was immense. And so over the period that the Romans have control of Britain, you do see some Roman emperors come up with creative ways to kind of reduce the barbarian incursions into Roman Britain. Famously, the Emperor Hadrian orders the construction of a wall across northern Britain to block the Picts from making overland raids into Britain. And this wall was actually relatively successful. It set a hard boundary for which land the Romans controlled and which ones that they weren't going to put effort into controlling. And that did help stabilize the situation. But unfortunately, walls are only good if you can afford to pay troops to maintain those walls and make sure that nobody's crossing over them when they shouldn't be. And it gets really, really expensive to maintain these fortifications, especially in the 3rd century, 4th century, and 5th centuries, when the Roman world seems to just be ping-ponging from one civil war to another. And so each time there's this new civil conflict going on, we see Roman emperors pull troops out of Britain to support their operations in the Roman heartland. And so by the year 410 AD, there isn't much of a Roman military in Britain left to speak of. They've all been pulled out of Britain to fight conflicts, fight in civil wars in Hispania, in Gaul, and some of them have even been pulled into conflicts against groups like the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths in Italy and Greece. So not that many troops left in Britain, even though it's still ostensibly a Roman province. And then, to make things even worse, not only do we have Picts making overland raids into Britain, we have the Irish making oversea raids into Britain. We also have Germanic pirates who are settled along the Baltic coast in mainland Europe, who are sailing to Britain and conducting pirate operations there. They're raiding coastal settlements, they're taking slaves, and they are, taking people's stuff, selling it for a profit. So the Roman military hired Germanic mercenaries and stationed them in Britannia, and these mercenaries get this idea that Britannia sounds like a really great place to settle down. And why is Britain so attractive? Well, Britain is really, really far away from a lot of the more powerful, kind of scarier barbarian groups like the Huns. And so if you're living along the Baltic coast, and you're hearing all these rumors about these, scary horsemen from the Eurasian steppe that are coming in and they're destroying all these Germanic tribes that live near the steppe land. And then your cousin comes back from his tour of duty as a mercenary in Roman Britain. He says, well, hey, we could go back to Britain, settle down there, start a life there, and get really far away from all of these problems that are going on here in mainland Europe. You might think that's a pretty good idea. So we do start to see a lot of these Germanic pirates establish communities, coastal communities in Roman Britain around this period. And a lot of the migrations that we see during this period of world history are because people are trying to get away from more powerful barbarian tribes. And that's why we see so many groups like the Franks, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes moving into different parts of Roman territory and trying to settle down there. They are being pushed out of their traditional homelands by the arrival of these new groups off the Eurasian steppe. So, by the end of the 4th century, Germanic tribesmen, and I'm referring mainly here to the Saxon tribes, these are the people who are from the region of Old Saxony in Germany, and they have settled down along that Baltic coast in Europe. It's these same people who are making these overseas raids into Britain. And some of these Saxons actually started establishing permanent settlements in Britain, making it even easier for them to conduct raids, because it's a lot easier to conduct a raid if you don't have to sail for 6 to 7 weeks to reach your target. The Romano Britons, by the end of the 4th century, are fully Roman citizens, and so they expected that the Roman Empire would protect them from these barbarian raiders. Unfortunately for them, that doesn't turn out to be the case. The Roman armies stationed in Britannia at this point were largely depleted because with each new civil war, the Roman emperors were pulling additional troops out of Britain and moving them into Italy, Gaul, and Hispania in order to deal with the more immediate conflicts, such as like I said, the civil wars, the arrival of the Goths, the Visigoths. We see many troops, for example, being pulled out of Britain to deal with Alaric's army in the early 400s AD. All of this eventually culminates in the event that we now kind of look to as the marker for the end of Roman rule in Britain. In 410 AD, the emperor of the Western Roman Empire, this is the Emperor Honorius, sent a letter to the British cities in which he told them that he was basically unable to offer them any kind of military assistance in their fight against these barbarian raiders. And he actually explicitly says in this letter that the people of Britain need to look to their own defense. They can't count on the Roman military to protect them anymore. Now, this is because Honorius was bogged down fighting against Alaric in Italy, and he just didn't really have any manpower to divert from the Italian front to help defend Britain. It does go to show you kind of where the Western emperor's priorities were. He was obviously very concerned about protecting the Roman heartland in Italy. And if that meant that, Roman citizens in Gaul, Hispania, or in Britain got a little bit less protection, then so be it. Sometimes that's just what happens. And when you run an empire like this, you're always going to make sure that your homeland is protected, even if it means that some of your provinces are going to suffer a little bit more. Ultimately, the Britons decided that if the Roman Empire wasn't going to shell out to protect them from these barbarian raiders, then they weren't going to listen to the Roman administrators, and that they actually had no loyalty to the Roman state. So the chronology here is a little confusing, but either just before or just after Honorius's letter was received in Britain, a lot of the British administrators were overthrown, and they were no longer ruling the cities in Roman Britain. I want you to try and imagine what it would be like to kind of experience this, being a person living in Roman Britain, thinking that the central government, the imperial military is supposed to protect you, and then it turns out that the imperial military is just totally leaving you to fend for yourself, right? It would be kind of like if someone living in modern day Guam or Puerto Rico, one of the United States overseas territories, it would be almost like if, say, the Russian or the Chinese Navy showed up and started bombing the living crap out of one of these overseas islands. The people that live in those islands are American citizens. They've paid taxes to the American government their whole life. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to reach out to the American government in Washington, and they're going to say, hey, you have to protect us. You have to send your Navy over here and help keep us safe, right? Imagine how shocking it would be if you're in that situation, you request help from the central government in Washington, D.C., and the American government comes back to you and says, hey, you're on your own. Even though you've paid taxes your whole life to the American government, you've considered yourself an American citizen your whole life, you're still being effectively abandoned by your central federal government. And that's kind of what this is like for the Romano British. Even though they have been loyal to Rome for centuries, literally centuries at this point, as soon as stuff starts to really get tough for the Romans, it's these provinces that are the first to lose that Roman protection. So after the Roman administrators were expelled, it seems the Romano-British population appointed their own local leaders to kind of oversee things. And we do know the names of some of these leaders. Unfortunately, we don't know how accurate these names are. It could be that these are the names of really just legendary figures that were kind of later papered on to a historical event, right? It's possible that these were not actually real people, or that they were only based off of real people, because a lot of these sources only come to us, they're written centuries later, and so we don't really have an idea of how necessarily accurate they are. But one of these leaders, arguably the most famous of these early Romano-British kings, is a guy by the name of Vortigern. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because Vortigern is something of a recurring character in Arthurian legends. He's kind of presented usually as like a contemporary or a rival of Arthur or Uther Pendragon. So he does, tend to come up in some of these Arthurian legends. According to the Venerable Bede, who is our main source for this period, he's an Anglo-Saxon monk who wrote a history of the English people in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. According to Bede, Vortigern actually invited some of these Germanic tribes to come to Britain as mercenaries. Vortigern, according to Bede, basically said, if you guys come over here and help protect us from the Picts and from the Irish, we'll give you some land to settle down on in what is now southeastern England. Specifically, Vortigern was said to have invited two brothers who led a group of these Germanic tribes. These brothers were named Hengist and Horsa, and Vortigern allegedly offered them the Isle of Thanet in Kent as their kind of new homeland where they could settle down in exchange for protecting them from these barbarian incursions. Of course, Hengist and Horsa are probably not real people. They're legendary figures. And there's a lot of different theories about how people came to believe that Hengist and Horsa were real historical figures. J.R.R. Tolkien, who, in addition to writing the Lord of the Rings books, was actually a very influential scholar in this period of Anglo-Saxon history. Tolkien believed that Hengist and Horsa, this legend developed out of a historical tradition where there was one king either named Hengist or Horsa, and this eventually developed into a legend about two brothers. Tolkien based this assumption off of a reference to a, Hengist Horsa figure in the later poem Beowulf. Other historians have suggested that the legend of Hengist and Horsa grew out of an ancient Indo-European tradition where these ancient Indo-Europeans would worship these twin horse gods. And somehow this tradition became associated with the arrival of the Saxons in Britain. Of course, the association with Hengist and horse and the horse gods sounds fairly obvious to us English speakers because Horsa sounds quite a bit like horse. If you look at a lot of the artwork, you see that Hengist and Horsa are depicted with horse banners. There's a very strong association between these figures and some kind of, horse mythology. And so there's a really strong connection between this idea of the ancient Indo-European horse cult and these two legendary figures in this period of history. Whatever the case, whether they were real people, legendary figures, whatever, Hengist and Horsa come to dominate the Welsh and the Anglo-Saxon chronicles that are being written about this period. So even if they never actually existed, it seems that later medieval chroniclers really believed that they were real historical figures, and they also really believed that these brothers were instrumental in the Germanic settlements of Britain. So according to this legend that gets recorded in the chronicles, the King Vortigern invites Hengist and Horsa to take a group of warriors and settle down on the island of Thanet, which is off the coast of Kent in modern-day England. In exchange, Hengist and Horsa promise to help defend Britain from the Picts and the Irish. This part of the story actually sounds pretty realistic to me. The Romans obviously had a long tradition of hiring Germanic mercenaries and offering them land in exchange for military service, and it's possible that the Romano Britons were trying to do the same thing. So this, like I said, this part of the story seems very, very plausible to me. However, it's the later parts of the story that start to get a little, mythological. And as you hear this, you might start to understand why very few modern historians really believe that Hengist and Horsa were actual historical figures. According to these legends, the relations between the Romano Britons and the newly arrived Germanic tribes deteriorated really quickly. According to these sources, Hengist and Horsa actually, after they got to Britain, wrote back to their family members back in their homeland about how weak the Romano Britons were, which honestly was true. The Romano-Britons really had no military to speak of at this point. And Hengist and Horsa make the case in these letters that it's actually going to be really easy for strong Germanic tribes like the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. These are a group of Germanic tribes that live along the same portion of the Baltic coast in Europe. It would be really easy for these tribes to come to Britain and defeat the Romano-British, take their stuff, take their land, and turn them into slaves. And obviously, according to these legends, that message is received very strongly by the Germanic tribes living along the Baltic coast. And it is this message that really triggers this wave of Germanic migration, and some would say Germanic invasion into Britain. Now, I want you to keep in mind that as I'm referring to these Germanic tribes that are invading Britain, settling down in Britain, we aren't talking about one unified ethnic group. We're actually talking about a wide variety of different Germanic tribes that had kind of a common linguistic and religious background, but who didn't really see themselves as belonging to the same political unit. It was very common for these tribes to go to war with each other, for example. They were anything but united. They were really rather divided. The three major tribal groups, I should say, that we are really talking about here are the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And it is these three tribes that, over the centuries after their settlement in Britain will constitute the new people that we refer to as the Anglo-Saxons. It seems to have been a lot of cultural exchange between these peoples. After they arrived in Britain, they shared a lot of the same language, and they worshipped, it seems to us that they worshipped the same gods as well. And so eventually, of course, this wouldn't happen for centuries, but eventually all of these groups of the descendants of these Germanic tribes would be united under one king, Alfred the Great. This is in the 800s AD. Alfred the Great actually is the first one to unify these Anglo-Saxons under his rule, and he's actually the one who starts calling them Anglo-Saxons in kind of a conscious effort to replace their old tribal identities with kind of a new national identity. So there's something of a proto-English nationalism that does end up happening. But like I said, that is going to happen centuries in the future, right? In the 400s AD, these groups are still very much divided. They're fighting amongst themselves, even as they're fighting with the Romano British and trying to seize control of the island of Britain. According to our legendary sources, Vortigern actually arranged for a treaty negotiation between himself and the Germanic chiefs. But the Germanic chiefs betrayed Vortigern's trust and they murdered his negotiating team, which again, supposedly triggers an all-out war between the Romano-British and the Germanic tribes. Vortigern's son is supposedly killed in battle, and Horsa is also recorded as having perished in battle as well. Hengist settles down in Kent, and he actually establishes a Saxon settlement there. And so later Anglo-Saxon kings who ruled over the area of Kent would claim to be descended from Hengist. He was kind of a legitimizing ancestral figure. They could go back and they say, well, of course I have the right to rule. I'm descended from Hengist, that famous guy that helped bring us all over here. And so obviously it's only natural that I should be king, right? The medieval chroniclers would have us believe that the Romano Britons and the Germanic tribes were engaged in all-out ethnic warfare. Now, is that actually the case? It's a matter of debate. Some historians have argued that the Germanic settlement in Britain was actually much more peaceful than the sources would have us believe. They point to evidence of intermarriage between the Germanic settlers and the native Romano Britons, and they also point to there is evidence that suggests that there were several Romano Britons living in areas ruled by these Germanic kings, but who were able to kind of run their business, run their farms, and go about their lives in something of a relative coexistence with their new Germanic neighbors. Other historians, however, reject this premise. They characterize the Germanic invasion of Britain as a brutal war of conquest, and they really characterize the native Romano Britons as being unable to stem the Germanic onslaught. The medieval chronicles do tend to back up this view, though they do tend to make things more dramatic. That's just part of the thing you do if you're a medieval chronicler, is you kind of amp up the drama, right? And so we don't know if this characterization is accurate or not. However, there is some linguistic and archaeological evidence to back up this view that the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes tended to kill or enslave the native Romano British. It's worth noting that the later descendants of these Germanic invaders, the later Anglo-Saxon people, they actually used the word for slave to describe the Romano British. They would use the term interchangeably for their slaves and to just talk about the Romano British people generally. And obviously, this implies that there was just a huge degree of enslavement of the native population that was going on at this time. And it's actually this word for slave, this Old English word for slave, that is the basis for the modern English terms for the descendants of the Romano British. We call them the Welsh, inhabitants of the nation of Wales, members of the Welsh nation. And that term, Welsh, is actually derived from the Old English word for slave or foreigner. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The Romano Britons and the Germanic tribes lived in close proximity for centuries, and they alternated between periods of relative peace and periods of all-out warfare. Usually, the Germanic invaders win the wars. They're better organized, their troops are better, and their kings seem to be more powerful than some of these Romano British princes. But the Romano Britons did manage to score some key victories against the Germanic tribes. Most famously, sometime between 500 and 504 AD, the Romano Britons scored a victory against an army of Saxons and Jutes at a place called Mons Badonicus, or Baden Hill. Now, Bede, who wrote about the Battle of Baden Hill in the 8th century, records the name of the Romano British commander at Baden Hill as Ambrosius Aurelianus. And Bede records that Ambrosius Aurelianus helped the Britons win a decisive victory, which ultimately delayed the Germanic expansion into Western Britain for several decades. In the 9th and 10th centuries, we start to see Welsh chroniclers record a different name for the man who led the Romano British in the Battle of Baden Hill. They said that a soldier by the name of Arthur had actually led the Romano British at the Battle of Baden, and that God granted Arthur victory over the pagan Germans because he carried a banner with the Virgin Mary on his shoulders as he fought. Well, who's this Arthur guy, you ask? This is the very same Arthur that over time would grow into the legendary Arthur, King of the Britons, or Arthur, King of Camelot. I should be clear that our earliest accounts of Arthur only claim that he was a warrior, not a king, but as time passed, people began to believe that in addition to being a warlord or a commander, he had also been king of the Romano British people. And these stories continued to grow until in the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth codified the first version of Arthurian legend in his book, The History of the Kings of Britain. Geoffrey wrote his book as if it were history. He was very clear these are events that actually happened, but it's evidently clear to modern historians that he made a lot of crap up. He took some really serious creative liberties, creating this fantastical world where Arthur was a legendary king of the Britons, and basically combining these earlier historical accounts in order to create a brand new legend. But people really bought what he was selling. They were huge fans of his book, and it ended up spawning the Arthurian genre as we know it today. Geoffrey expanded on the tidbits of Arthur's legend that existed in the earlier Welsh sources, and he created his own version of Arthur. And his version of Arthur is a legendary Welsh king who defeated the Saxons at Baden Hill before he was ultimately killed by his nephew Mordred at the Battle of Camlan. Like Hengist and Horsa, Arthur was probably not a real historical figure. In fact, it seems that he was originally something of a mythological hero, like Achilles or Beowulf, who helped defend Britain from supernatural threats. Our earliest poetic attestations of Arthur have him fighting werewolves, giants, and witches. And over time, it seems that the Welsh chroniclers came to associate this version of Arthur with the historical figure of Ambrosius Aurelianus until they had merged the two figures into one single legendary king of the Britons. If you'd like to learn more about the basis of Arthurian myth, I highly recommend Thomas Green's Concepts of Arthur, which compares the earliest poetic attestations of Arthur to the later legends about him. Green actually speculates that Arthur may have originally been a Celtic deity who was subsequently turned into a heroic figure after the Romano Britons converted to Christianity. We will be returning to Arthur throughout this series, as the legends about him and his court eventually became incredibly popular throughout medieval Europe. For the purposes of today's episode, we're going to move on to cover another important legendary figure, and that is Cerdic of Wessex. Cerdic was a legendary king who supposedly ruled the group of Saxons that settled down in western England. His name, interestingly enough, is actually Celtic in origin, which has led some scholars to suggest that Cerdic may have been a descendant of Romano Britons who, over time, actually assimilated to the Saxon culture. Cerdic was believed to have founded the House of Wessex, that is, the house of the West Saxons. He's believed to be the ancestor of this line of West Saxon kings, and later West Saxon kings would claim to be his descendants in order to boost their own political legitimacy. There are some historians who believe that Cerdic was the Saxon king defeated by Ambrosius Aurelianus at the Battle of Baden Hill, but this is not a widely held view, it's a minority view. The real reason I'm bringing Cerdic up is because the later kings who claim to be his descendants actually proved to be instrumental in the unification of England and the forging of a common English identity. Cerdic's descendants would centuries later lead the English through the Viking invasions of Britain, and ultimately these descendants of Cerdic would proclaim themselves as the first kings of England and the first kings of all the English. But that's a topic for a later episode. We'll end today by talking briefly about religion, specifically the religious divide between the Romano Britons on one hand and the Germanic tribes on the other. By 410 AD, most of the Romano British population had converted to Christianity. There were probably some pagan holdouts who worshipped a mixed pantheon of Celtic and Roman gods, but the urban centers and many of the rural estates were centers of Christian worship by 410. Romano British clergy became important figures in the Christianization of Ireland, including most famously St. Patrick. He actually grew up in Wales before he was kidnapped and sold as a slave to Ireland, and then after he escaped, he actually returned to Ireland to do missionary work there. The hostilities between the Romano British and the Germanic invaders, however, prevented any kind of missionary outreach between the Romano Britons and the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. And so even though we see Romano British clergy converting people in Ireland, they never made an effort to convert their Germanic neighbors. As the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes lived outside the Roman Empire's jurisdiction before the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, they didn't come into contact with Christianity in the same way that other barbarian peoples such as the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and Franks did. In fact, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes worshipped the Germanic pantheon, featuring gods like Odin or Woden, Thor or Thunor, and Tyr or Tu. And they worshipped these gods well into the 7th century, and that's when Pope Gregory the Great, the Roman pontiff, sent the first group of missionaries to Germanic settlements in Britain. The Romano Britons were in no rush to share their Christian faith with the Germanic tribes. After all, they'd been at war with the Germanic tribes for literally hundreds of years, and it's very possible that the Romano Britons took some comfort in the idea that their ethnic rivals would be punished in hell and tortured in hell forever for being pagans. And if someone screwed you over, took your land, enslaved your family members, you probably wouldn't be in a rush to try and save their soul, right? The Romano Britons also seem to have viewed their religion as a strategic advantage. You'll remember that Arthur was said to have triumphed at Baden Hill because he wore a banner that had the Virgin Mary on it. Early medieval Christians really believed that their faith gave them an advantage in battle because obviously the Christian God would favor them in any kind of fight they had against pagan foes. However, if you're about to go to war with a neighboring tribe and you convert that neighboring tribe to Christianity, you then lose that strategic advantage. You lose God's favor because God is going to be less likely to favor you in a fight against fellow Christians than he would be if you were fighting pagans. At least that's how early medieval people thought about it. So we'll end today's episode in the middle of the 6th century, when southern Britain is pretty much divided between the Christian Romano Britons in the west and an assemblage of pagan Germanic tribes living on the eastern part of the island. Over centuries, the identities of these groups would shift and change, and the Romano Britons would develop into the early medieval Welsh nation, and the Germanic tribes developed their own Anglo-Saxon or English identity, in which they merged a lot of their disparate tribal identities into one unified national identity. Despite the victory at Baden Hill, the Romano British were unable to stem the tide of Germanic settlement in Britain, and by the 10th and 11th centuries, many of the surviving Welsh kingdoms were forced to pay tribute to the Anglo-Saxon kings. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. As always, you can leave feedback at our website, which I'll link in the show notes. You can also go to the website if you are curious about our bibliography. I always link the episode bibliographies there in case you're interested in some further reading or you're curious about the sources that I'm using. I hope you'll join us next week when we're going to be diving into one of my favorite parts of early medieval history, which is we'll be talking about the age of Germanic heroes and a lot of the legendary figures that spring up alongside people like Hengist, Horsa, and Cerdic. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.